The dust kicked up behind the old wagon as it rolled into the small trading post. It was a hot day in Arizona territory, and the sun beat down like fire on everything it touched. The year was 1875, and this place felt like the edge of the world. Samuel Crawford pulled his hat down over his eyes and looked around. He was 23 years old, with pale skin that had already started to burn during his long journey from back east. His hands were soft from working in his father's store in Pennsylvania, not rough like the hands of men who lived out here in the desert. The trading post wasn't much to look at. Just a few wooden buildings that looked tired and worn from the heat and wind. But Samuel had big dreams. He'd heard stories about men making fortunes trading with the local people. He had a wagon full of goods and enough money saved up to last him 6 months. That should be plenty of time to get rich, he figured. As he climbed down from his wagon, Samuel noticed he wasn't alone. A group of Apache people had been watching him from the shade of some nearby trees. They'd probably heard his wagon coming from miles away. Nothing moved quietly in this desert. The Apache men looked tough and weathered like they belonged to this harsh land. Their skin was dark from the sun, and their eyes seemed to see everything. Samuel felt small under their gaze. Back home, he'd been confident and sure of himself. Here he felt like a child who'd wandered into a place where he didn't belong. One of the Apache men stepped forward. He was tall and strong, with gray streaks in his black hair that showed his age and wisdom. This was Nalnish, though Samuel didn't know his name yet. The Apache leader looked at Samuel's pale skin, his clean clothes, and his soft hands. He saw a young man who'd never spent a day working under the desert sun. Samuel tried to look confident as he walked toward the group. His boots weren't made for desert sand, and he stumbled a little as he approached. Behind Nalnish, some of the younger Apache men exchanged looks. One of them said something in their language, and a few others smiled. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he could guess they weren't saying nice things about him. The trading post owner, an old man named Pete, came out to greet Samuel. Pete had been living in the desert for 15 years, and his skin looked like old leather. He shook Samuel's hand and introduced him to Nalnish. "This here is the chief," Pete said, though Nalnish was actually a war leader, not a chief. Samuel didn't know the difference yet. "He speaks some English, but you'll want to learn their ways if you plan on doing business out here." Samuel nodded and held out his hand to Nalnish. The Apache leader looked at the offered hand for a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm and strong, and Samuel felt like his own hand might break. "I'm here to trade," Samuel said, speaking slowly and loudly, like Nalnish might be deaf. "I have good things in my wagon." Nalnish raised an eyebrow at Samuel's tone but said nothing. Behind him, more Apache people had gathered to see the newcomer. Women with babies on their backs, children who stared with curious eyes, and old men who'd seen many traders come and go over the years. Samuel went to his wagon and started pulling out his goods. He had mirrors, colorful beads, cheap jewelry, and bolts of bright cloth. These were the kinds of things that trading companies back east said would be perfect for trading with native people. Samuel had spent most of his money on these items. He spread them out on a blanket and looked up at the Apache people expectantly. Surely they'd be impressed by all these wonderful things from the civilized world. But instead of excitement, Samuel saw polite interest at best. The women looked at his cloth and beads, but their faces didn't show the amazement he'd expected. The men examined his mirrors and trinkets, but they didn't seem eager to trade away their valuable furs and handmade goods for these cheap items. One of the younger Apache men said something to his friends, and they laughed quietly. Samuel's face turned red, though he wasn't sure if it was from embarrassment or sunburn. Nalnish picked up one of Samuel's mirrors and looked at it closely. The glass was thin, and the frame was made of cheap metal that was already starting to tarnish in the desert air. He set it down gently and shook his head. "These things break easy," Nalnish said in careful English. "We need things that last." Samuel felt his confidence start to crack, just like his cheap mirrors probably would in this harsh climate. Back home, these items had seemed so valuable and exotic. Here, they looked like what they really were, cheap goods made to fool people who didn't know any better. As the day wore on, Samuel tried to make deals, but nothing went well. He offered handfuls of beads for beautiful pottery that had taken days to make. He wanted to trade a small mirror for a buckskin shirt that represented hours of skilled work. Each offer was politely refused, and Samuel could see the Apache people losing interest in him. By evening, Samuel had made only one small trade, a few metal needles for some jerky. The needles were actually useful, unlike most of his other goods, and the Apache women knew good tools when they saw them. As the Apache people prepared to leave for their camp, Samuel heard more quiet conversations in their language. He caught a few glances in his direction and saw some smiles that didn't look friendly. He was pretty sure they were making jokes about him. One young Apache warrior made a comment that caused several others to laugh loudly. An older woman shushed them, but Samuel had gotten the message. To them, he looked like an easy target, a soft, pale man who'd probably run home to his mother at the first sign of real trouble. That night, Samuel sat by his campfire feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. The desert around him was full of sounds he didn't recognize, the calls of night birds, the rustle of small animals, and the whisper of wind through the rocks. Every sound made him jump. Pete came over and sat down beside him. "Rough first day?" the old trader asked. Samuel nodded, staring into the flames. "They think I'm weak," he said quietly. "Well," Pete said, spitting into the fire where it hissed. "Are you?" The question hit Samuel like a punch. Back home, he'd never thought of himself as weak. He could add numbers faster than anyone in town, and could convince customers to buy things they didn't really need. But those skills didn't mean much out here. "I don't know," Samuel admitted. Pete studied him in the firelight. "This land doesn't care about where you come from or what you used to be," he said. "It only cares about who you are right now. And right now, you look like a man who's got a lot to learn." As Samuel lay down to sleep that night, he could hear distant sounds from the Apache camp, voices talking, children playing, and the soft rhythm of drums. It sounded like a real community, full of people who belonged together and knew how to live in this place. Samuel pulled his blanket up to his chin and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake coming here. Tomorrow, he'd have to face those mocking looks again and try to prove he was more than just another foolish white man who thought he could get rich quick in the desert. But something deep inside him, something he didn't even know was there yet, whispered that he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The second day started badly for Samuel and only got worse as the sun climbed higher in the sky. He'd barely slept the night before. Every sound in the desert had made him sit up and look around. When morning came, his eyes were red and tired, and his pale skin was already showing the signs of too much sun. He looked like a man who didn't belong here, and everyone could see it. The Apache people returned to the trading post around mid-morning. Samuel had spent the early hours rearranging his goods, hoping they'd look more appealing in the daylight. He'd practiced what he wanted to say, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But when Nalnish and his people arrived, Samuel's careful plans fell apart immediately. "Good morning, Chief," Samuel called out loudly, waving his arm like he was greeting someone across a busy street. The Apache people turned to look at him, and Samuel saw several of them exchange glances. He was already making mistakes, and the day had just begun. Nalnish walked over slowly, his face showing no emotion. Behind him, some of the younger men were trying not to smile. Samuel's loud, cheerful greeting sounded foolish in the quiet desert morning. "I have better things to show you today," Samuel announced, pulling out what he thought were his finest goods. He held up a string of glass beads that caught the sunlight and sparkled like tiny jewels. "Very beautiful," Samuel said, speaking slowly and loudly again. "Perfect for your ladies." He gestured toward the Apache women, who watched him with expressions that Samuel couldn't read. One of the women said something quietly to her friend, and they both looked away. Samuel didn't know it, but she'd just said that the beads were pretty but would break before winter came. Apache women made jewelry that lasted for generations. They had no use for fragile trinkets. Samuel didn't understand why his demonstration wasn't working. Back home, women would have crowded around to see such fine beads. He decided he needed to try harder. Look," he said, holding the beads up higher. "From New York. Very expensive." He was practically shouting now, as if volume would somehow make his goods more valuable. Nalnish held up a hand for silence. "We can hear you," he said quietly. "You do not need to yell." Samuel's face turned red. Around him, some of the Apache children giggled and their mothers shushed them gently. Samuel was beginning to realize that his loud, enthusiastic approach wasn't working, but he didn't know what else to do. He tried a different tactic. Pulling out a small hand mirror with a decorated frame, He held it up so the sun reflected off its surface. The bright flash of light made everyone blink and look away. "Magic glass," Samuel announced, proud of what he thought was a clever presentation. "Shows your face. Very useful." The Apache people looked puzzled, and Samuel realized they might not understand what a mirror was for. He held it up to his own face and made exaggerated expressions, trying to show them how it worked. "See? You can see yourself." He held the mirror toward one of the Apache men, who stepped back like Samuel was pointing a weapon at him. What Samuel didn't understand was that many Apache people had complex beliefs about reflections and images. His casual use of the mirror, flashing light around and shoving it at people, was not just rude, it was culturally inappropriate. But Samuel had no idea he was causing offense. An old Apache woman spoke sharply to Nalnish, who nodded and said something back to her in their language. Samuel caught the tone and realized he'd done something wrong, but he had no idea what. Maybe something else? Samuel said, his confidence starting to crack. He put the mirror away quickly and looked through his other goods. He pulled out a bolt of bright red cloth that had cost him $20 back in Pennsylvania. The color was vivid and eye-catching, and Samuel was sure this would impress them. "Beautiful cloth," he said, unrolling a few yards of the material. "Perfect for dresses. For... He gestured helplessly, not knowing the Apache words for clothing or how to explain what the cloth could be used for. One of the Apache women came forward and felt the cloth between her fingers. She examined it carefully, looking at how it was woven and testing its strength. After a moment, she shook her head and said something to the other women. Samuel watched hopefully, but he could tell from their expressions that they weren't impressed. What he didn't know was that the cloth, while pretty, was much thinner and weaker than the materials the Apache people made themselves. It wouldn't last through a single hard season in the desert. Getting desperate, Samuel started pulling out item after item: cheap jewelry, small bells, ribbons, and trinkets of all kinds. He spread them out on his blanket like a traveling salesman, talking constantly about how wonderful and valuable everything was. "This one from Boston. This one very rare. Special price for you today." The Apache people watched this performance with growing amusement. Samuel was sweating now, both from the heat and from his growing panic. Nothing he did seemed to work. Every item he showed them was examined politely and then set aside. Finally, young Apache warrior named Key, who couldn't have been more than 18, said something to his friends that made them all burst out laughing. Samuel didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. They were making fun of him. What did he say? Samuel asked Pete, who was watching from the shade of the trading post. Pete shook his head. "You don't want to know, son." But Samuel did want to know. He was tired of being laughed at and dismissed. "Tell me," he insisted. Pete sighed. "He said you remind him of a prairie dog. Lots of noise and running around, but not much sense." The comparison stung, but Samuel could see why they'd make it. He had been chattering nervously and darting around his goods like an anxious animal. The image wasn't flattering, but it wasn't entirely unfair either. As the morning wore on, Samuel's situation got worse. He tried different approaches, being more serious, then more friendly, then more businesslike. Nothing worked. The Apache people remained polite but uninterested, and Samuel could see he was losing whatever small credibility he might have had. The final embarrassment came when Samuel tried to demonstrate a small music box he'd brought. He wound it up and set it on the ground, where it played a tinny version of "Oh Susanna" while a tiny dancer spun around inside. The Apache children gathered around to watch, fascinated by the mechanical toy. Samuel smiled, thinking he'd finally found something that impressed them. But then the music box ran down and stopped, and one curious child picked it up to look inside. The cheap mechanism broke immediately. Springs and tiny gears scattered in the sand, and the little dancer fell off her post. The child looked up at Samuel with disappointment, holding the broken pieces. Samuel's heart sank. Even his most impressive item had proven to be fragile junk that couldn't survive 5 minutes in the hands of a curious child. He knelt down and tried to put the music box back together, but it was hopeless. The delicate parts were already getting sand in them, and some pieces were missing entirely. As he crouched in the dirt, trying desperately to fix the broken toy, Samuel heard quiet conversations around him. He didn't need to understand Apache to know what they were saying. Here was a man who brought them things that broke at the first touch. What kind of traitor was that? When Samuel finally gave up on the music box and stood up, he saw Nalnish watching him with an expression that wasn't quite contempt, but wasn't respect either. It was the look someone might give to a child who was trying to do adult work but didn't have the skills yet. That look hurt worse than all the laughter and whispered jokes combined. Samuel had come here thinking he was a businessman, a trader who would make his fortune dealing with these people. Instead, he was seen as a foolish boy with a wagon full of worthless trinkets. The Apache people began to drift away as the afternoon heat grew stronger. They had their own work to do, their own lives to live. Samuel wasn't worth any more of their time. As they left, Samuel heard Key make another comment that caused fresh laughter. This time, Samuel didn't ask Pete to translate. He was pretty sure he didn't want to know what new comparison they'd made. That evening, Samuel sat by his campfire again, staring at his scattered goods. Everything looked different now. Cheaper, more foolish, more obviously worthless. He'd spent months planning this venture, and most of his savings buying these items. Now they looked like what they were, junk that no sensible person would want. Pete came over and sat down without being invited. "You know," the old man said, "I once knew a trader who came out here with a wagon full of fancy pocket watches. Thought everyone would want to know what time it was." "What happened to him?" Samuel asked. "Well," Pete said, poking at the fire with a stick, "turns out folks out here tell time by the sun and the seasons. Don't much need a fancy watch to know when to get up or when to plant corn." Samuel understood the lesson. He'd been trying to sell people things they didn't need, with no understanding of what they actually wanted or valued. "So what do they want?" Samuel asked. Pete looked at him thoughtfully. "Same thing everybody wants, I reckon. Things that work. Things that last. Things that make their lives better." As Samuel lay down to sleep that second night, he could still hear the distant sounds from the Apache camp. But now those sounds seemed different. Not mysterious or threatening, but like the voices of real people living real lives. The third day brought Samuel a chance he never expected, a chance to prove he was more than just a foolish trader with a wagon full of junk. It started with the wind. Samuel woke up to a strange sound he'd never heard before, a low moaning that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sky, which had been clear and blue for days, was now dark with clouds that moved fast across the desert. Pete was already up, moving around the trading post with urgent energy. "Storm coming," he called to Samuel. Big one by the looks of it. Samuel looked at the approaching clouds and felt his stomach drop. He'd never seen a desert storm before, but even he could tell this was going to be bad. The wind was getting stronger by the minute, and he could smell rain in the air. Lots of it. "What do we do?" Samuel asked, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "Get everything inside or tied down," Pete replied, already dragging sacks of grain toward the trading post building. "Flash floods out here can wash away anything that ain't nailed down." Samuel had heard about flash floods, but he'd never really understood what they meant. Back in Pennsylvania, rain just made things muddy. Here in the desert, where the ground was hard and dry, rain had nowhere to go except rushing along the surface, picking up speed and power as it flowed. The Apache camp had already noticed the approaching storm. Samuel could see people moving quickly, securing their belongings and preparing their shelters. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd lived through many such storms. Samuel started grabbing his own goods, trying to get them into his wagon where they'd be protected. But as he worked, he noticed something that made his heart race with fear. The Apache people had stored some of their most valuable possessions in the trading post building for safekeeping. Bundles of beautiful blankets, containers of food, tools, and other precious items were stacked in one corner. If the trading post flooded, those items would be ruined. And from what Samuel could see, the building wasn't in the best shape. The roof had several loose boards, and water was already starting to seep in around the windows as the first drops of rain began to fall. "Pete," Samuel called out, "what about all the Apache stuff in there?" Pete looked over at the building and cursed under his breath. "Damn, I forgot about that." He looked at the approaching storm and shook his head. "Nothing we can do now. Building's the best shelter we got." But Samuel wasn't satisfied with that answer. These people had already laughed at him, dismissed him as weak and foolish. But their belongings were in danger, and he couldn't just let them get destroyed without trying to help. The rain started in earnest, just as Samuel made his decision. Instead of finishing with his own goods, he ran toward the trading post building where the Apache belongings were stored. "What are you doing?" Pete yelled over the increasing wind. "Trying to save their stuff," Samuel yelled back, already getting soaked by the heavy raindrops. Inside the building, Samuel could see that his fears were justified. Water was starting to drip from several places in the roof, and one corner was already getting wet. If the storm got much worse, everything stored there would be damaged or destroyed. Samuel started grabbing bundles and containers, carrying them to the driest part of the building. The items were heavier than he'd expected. Apache goods were made to last, which meant they were built solid. His soft hands weren't used to this kind of work, and within minutes he could feel blisters starting to form, but he didn't stop. Bundle after bundle, container after container, Samuel moved the Apache belongings to higher, drier ground. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind was howling around the building like a living thing. Pete had finished securing his own goods and came to help, but most of the work fell to Samuel. The old trader's arthritis made it hard for him to lift heavy objects, so Samuel found himself doing most of the carrying. As the storm grew worse, Samuel discovered just how little he knew about desert weather. This wasn't like the gentle rains back home that fell steadily for hours. This was like someone had opened a dam in the sky. Water came down in sheets so thick he could barely see a few feet ahead, and then he heard it, a sound like thunder but constant and growing louder. Pete's face went pale when he heard it too. "Flash flood," the old man whispered. Looking out through the rain, Samuel could see a wall of water rushing toward them across the desert floor. It was brown with mud and debris, and it was moving faster than a horse could run. In that moment, Samuel understood why people feared desert storms. The water hit the trading post area like a freight train. It swirled around the buildings, carrying away anything that wasn't secured. Samuel watched in horror as some of his own goods, items he hadn't had time to properly secure, disappeared into the churning flood. But the Apache belongings were safe. Samuel had moved them all to the highest, driest part of the building just in time. His hands were bleeding now from the rough work, and his soft trader's clothes were soaked and torn. But everything was protected. The storm raged for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. When it finally started to calm down, Samuel and Pete ventured outside to see the damage. The landscape had changed completely. Where there had been dry washes and sandy areas, there were now rivers of muddy water. Debris was scattered everywhere. Pieces of wood, dead bushes, even a few dead animals that had been caught in the flood. Some of Samuel's goods had been lost completely, washed away by the powerful water. His wagon had been pushed several yards from where he'd left it, and some of his remaining items were scattered and damaged. But he was alive. Pete was alive, and the Apache belongings were safe. That was what mattered. As the sun began to peek through the breaking clouds, Nalnish and several other Apache people made their way carefully across the muddy ground to check on their stored possessions. Samuel was sitting on the steps of the trading post, exhausted and muddy, trying to bandage his bleeding hands with strips torn from his shirt. Nalnish looked at Samuel, then at the building where their belongings had been stored. He could see that everything was dry and undamaged. He could also see Samuel's torn clothes, his bleeding hands, and the scattered remains of the young trader's own goods. "You saved our things," Nalnish said quietly. Samuel looked up, surprised to hear the Apache leader speaking to him directly. Yes, sir. I tried to." Nalnish studied Samuel's face, seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. This wasn't the same foolish young man who'd been waving mirrors around and shouting about his cheap trinkets. This was someone who'd worked through the night in dangerous conditions to protect other people's property, even when his own was in danger. "Your hands," Nalnish said, nodding toward Samuel's makeshift bandages. Samuel looked down at his hands and was surprised by how bad they looked. The soft skin had blistered and torn during the night's work. Back home, these would have been serious injuries that kept him from working for days. "They're fine," Samuel said, though they hurt more than he wanted to admit. Nalnish called out to someone in Apache, and one of the women came forward carrying a small pot of something that looked like plant paste. Without asking permission, she took Samuel's hands and began cleaning the cuts with water from a gourd. The medicine stung, but Samuel didn't pull away. The woman worked carefully, applying the paste to his wounds and wrapping them with clean strips of soft leather. Her touch was gentle but efficient. the work of someone who'd treated many injuries over the years. As she worked, Samuel became aware that other Apache people had gathered around. They were looking at him differently than they had before, not with mockery or dismissal, but with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Thank you," Samuel said to the woman when she finished with his hands. She nodded and said something in Apache that sounded kind. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Nalnish was still studying Samuel with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "Why?" he asked simply. Samuel didn't have to ask what he meant. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "Those things were important to you." It was a simple answer, but Nalnish could hear the truth in it. This young white man hadn't saved their belongings to try to impress them or to make a better trade deal. He'd done it because he saw people's precious possessions in danger and couldn't just let them be destroyed. "Your own goods," Nalnish said, gesturing toward Samuel's scattered and damaged merchandise. Samuel looked at what remained of his trading stock and shrugged. "Things can be replaced," he said. "I couldn't replace what belonged to you." As the Apache people began to gather their saved belongings, Samuel heard a different kind of conversation than he'd heard before. The words were still in Apache, so he couldn't understand them, but the tone was different. People were talking about him, but not with laughter or dismissal. They sounded thoughtful. Later that day, as everyone worked to clean up the damage from the storm, Samuel found himself working alongside Apache people for the first time. Nobody had asked him to help, but when he saw them clearing debris and checking for damage, he just started helping. His bandaged hands made the work difficult, but he kept at it. When he struggled with a heavy branch that the flood had deposited against someone's shelter, 2 Apache men came over and helped him move it without being asked. The invitation to visit the Apache camp was both exciting and terrifying for Samuel. He'd never been inside a Native American community before, and he had no idea what to expect or how to behave. The morning after the storm, Samuel cleaned himself up as best he could and made his way to where the Apache people had set up their temporary shelters. His hands were still sore and bandaged, but the strange plant medicine the woman had used seemed to be helping them heal faster than he'd expected. As he approached the camp, Samuel felt nervous energy building in his chest. What if this was some kind of test he didn't understand? What if he said or did something wrong and offended everyone again? But Nalnish greeted him with something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't unfriendly either. "Come," the Apache leader said, gesturing toward the center of the camp. "We will talk." The Apache camp was nothing like Samuel had imagined. He'd expected something primitive or temporary, but what he saw was a well-organized community. Even though this was just a temporary setup after the storm, everything had its place and purpose. Children played games that Samuel didn't recognize, their laughter mixing with the sound of adults talking quietly as they went about their daily work. Women tended to cooking fires and repaired storm damage with practiced efficiency. Men worked on tools and weapons, their hands moving with the confidence that came from a lifetime of practice. What struck Samuel most was how calm and purposeful everything seemed. There was no rushing around or shouting, no sense of chaos or confusion. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they needed to do and how to do it well. Nalnish led Samuel to where an old man sat in the shade of a makeshift shelter. The man's hair was completely white, and his face was deeply lined with age, but his eyes were bright and alert. "This is Hosteen Begay," Nalnish said. "He teaches young ones about the old ways. He will teach you too if you want to learn." Samuel looked at the old man, who studied him with the same careful attention that Nalnish had shown. "Teach me what?" Samuel asked. "How to live here," Hosteen Begay said in English that was careful but clear. "How to see what is important. How to trade with honor." Over the following days, Samuel found himself spending more and more time with Hosteen Begay and the Apache people. At first he came just during the day, returning to his camp at the trading post each evening. But gradually, as he became more comfortable and the Apache people became more accepting of his presence, he started staying later and later. The learning was unlike anything Samuel had experienced in school back east. There were no books or written lessons. Instead, Hosteen Begay taught through stories, demonstrations, and patient correction when Samuel made mistakes. "You want to trade horses," the old man said one afternoon as they sat watching some young Apache men work with their animals. "But you know nothing about horses. How can you trade what you do not understand? Samuel had to admit that was true. Back in Pennsylvania, he'd never worked with horses beyond the old draft animal that pulled delivery wagons around town. These Apache horses were different, faster, stronger, and clearly much more valuable. Watch, Hostine Begay said, pointing to one of the young men who was examining a horse's legs. He looks for signs of injury or weakness. He feels the muscle and bone. He watches how the animal moves. Samuel tried to pay attention, but at first all horses looked the same to him. Hostine Begay was patient, though, pointing out details that Samuel had never noticed. The way a healthy horse held its head, the difference between a confident step and a hesitant one, the signs that showed whether an animal was young and strong or getting old. Now you try, the old man said after several days of watching. Samuel approached one of the horses nervously. The animal was much bigger up close than it had seemed from a distance, and its dark eyes seemed to see right through him. Easy, Hostine Begay said quietly. The horse can feel your fear. Be calm. Samuel took a deep breath and tried to relax. He reached out slowly and touched the horse's neck, the way he'd seen the Apache men do. The animal's skin was warm and smooth under his hand, and after a moment it lowered its head slightly, as if accepting his presence. Good, the old man said. Now look at the legs. Samuel tried to examine the horse the way he'd been taught, but his inexperience showed immediately. He missed obvious signs that Hostine Begay had to point out, and his movements were clumsy compared to the smooth efficiency of the Apache horsemen. But nobody laughed at his mistakes. Instead, they corrected him patiently, showing him the right way to do things over and over until he started to understand. The language lessons were even more challenging. Apache was unlike any language Samuel had ever heard, with sounds that seemed impossible for his English-speaking mouth to make. His early attempts at pronunciation were so bad that they sometimes meant completely different things than what he intended to say. One morning, Samuel tried to say good morning in Apache, but messed up the sound so badly that he actually said something about his grandmother being a coyote. The children who heard him burst into giggles, and even some of the adults had to cover their mouths to hide their smiles. Samuel's face turned red with embarrassment, but Hostine Begay just nodded calmly. Try again, he said. Slower this time. Samuel tried again and again until he could produce something that sounded roughly like what he was supposed to be saying. It wasn't perfect, but it was understandable, and that was progress. Language is like riding a horse, Hostine Begay told him. You will fall off many times before you learn to stay on, but each time you fall, you learn something new. As the days passed, Samuel began to notice changes in how the Apache people treated him. The open mockery had stopped completely, replaced by a kind of patient tolerance. People still corrected his mistakes, but they did it kindly, like they were teaching a child who was genuinely trying to learn. The children, especially, seemed to enjoy his clumsy attempts at their language and customs. They would gather around when Hostine Begay was teaching him, sometimes offering their own corrections or demonstrations. Samuel found their patience both humbling and encouraging. But it wasn't just language and horse trading that Samuel was learning. He was beginning to understand how the Apache community worked, the complex relationships between families, the unspoken rules that governed behavior, the deep connection these people had to the land around them. One afternoon, Samuel watched as a group of women processed plants they'd gathered from the desert. Their hands moved with practiced skill, separating useful parts from waste, preparing medicines and food with techniques passed down through generations. Can you show me? Samuel asked one of the women, a middle-aged mother named Ayana who had been one of the first to stop laughing at his mistakes. Ayana looked surprised by the request, but she nodded and showed him how to identify which parts of the plant were valuable. Samuel's soft hands weren't good at the delicate work, and he crushed several valuable leaves before he started to get the hang of it. Like this, Ayana said patiently, demonstrating the light touch needed to separate the plant fibers. Too hard and you destroy what you're trying to save. It was a lesson that went beyond plant processing, and Samuel understood that. In his early attempts at trading, he'd been too aggressive, too pushy. He'd tried to force deals instead of building the relationships that made good trading possible. As Samuel's understanding grew, so did his usefulness to the community. His knowledge of mathematics, while not directly applicable to Apache life, proved helpful in unexpected ways. When the community needed to calculate how much food would be needed for a planned journey, Samuel was able to work out the numbers quickly and accurately. His experience with mechanical things also proved valuable. When a valuable knife broke, Samuel was able to suggest a way to repair it using some metal wire from his trading goods. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it made the tool usable again until a proper repair could be made. These small contributions didn't go unnoticed. Samuel could see that people were starting to view him as potentially useful, rather than just an amusing outsider who was trying to learn their ways. But perhaps the most important change was in Samuel himself. The soft-handed young man who'd arrived with a wagon full of cheap trinkets was gone. In his place was someone who was learning to see value in things that couldn't be bought or sold: knowledge, relationships, respect, and the kind of practical skills that helped people survive and thrive in harsh conditions. His hands, though still tender from the storm night, were getting tougher from daily work. His skin was darkening from constant exposure to the desert sun. His movements were becoming more confident as he learned to read the land and the weather. One evening, as Samuel sat with Hostine Begay watching the sunset paint the desert rocks in shades of red and gold, the old man spoke quietly. "You are different now than when you came." Samuel nodded, thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks. "I'm trying to learn." "Learning is good," Hostine Begay said, "but more important is understanding. You begin to understand that people are more valuable than things. That respect must be earned, not demanded. That the land will teach you if you listen." As they sat in comfortable silence, Samuel realized that the old man was right. He was different now, and not just in obvious ways like his son. The peaceful routine of Samuel's learning was shattered on a hot morning in July, when a young Apache scout came riding into camp at full speed, his horse covered in sweat and dust. Samuel was sitting with Hostine Begay, practicing his Apache vocabulary, when they heard the sound of urgent voices. The old man's expression immediately became serious, and he stood up with a speed that surprised Samuel. "What's happening?" Samuel asked, but Hostine Begay was already walking quickly toward where a crowd was gathering around the scout. Samuel followed, his stomach tightening with worry. Even though he couldn't understand all the rapid Apache being spoken, he could hear the urgency and fear in the voices. Something was very wrong. Nalnish emerged from his shelter and strode over to the scout, who began speaking quickly in Apache while pointing toward the south. Samuel caught a few words he recognized: Mexican and guns and horses, but not enough to understand what was happening. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other Apache men asking questions and the scout providing answers. Samuel could see the tension building in the group as more details emerged. Finally, Nalnish turned to address the whole community. He spoke in Apache first, and Samuel watched as expressions of worry and anger spread across people's faces. Women began moving their children closer, and the men started checking their weapons. Then Nalnish turned to Samuel. "Mexican raiders," he said in English. 20, maybe 30 men. They come this way looking for horses and captives to sell." Samuel felt his blood run cold. He'd heard stories about raiders who crossed the border to steal livestock and capture people to sell into slavery. These weren't soldiers or legitimate traders, they were bandits who lived by violence and theft. "How far away?" Samuel asked. "Maybe one day's ride," Nalnish replied. "They will be here tomorrow, maybe the day after." Samuel looked around the camp, trying to count how many Apache men were present. He came up with maybe 15 or 16 who looked old enough to fight. "Against 20 or 30 armed raiders, those weren't good odds. What will you do?" Samuel asked. Nalnish's jaw was set in a hard line. "We fight. This is our land. Our families are here." Samuel nodded, understanding the decision even though it frightened him. These people couldn't just pack up and run every time danger appeared. This was their home, and they would defend it. "You should go," Nalnish said to Samuel. "Take Pete and leave now. Go back to your people where you will be safe." The suggestion made perfect sense. Samuel wasn't Apache, and this wasn't his fight. He had no experience with violence or warfare, and his presence would probably just make things more dangerous for everyone. The smart thing to do would be to hitch up his wagon and get as far away as possible before the raiders arrived. But as Samuel looked around the camp, at Hostine Begay, who had patiently taught him so much, at Ayana, who had shown him kindness when he'd been struggling to learn, at the children who had giggled at his language mistakes but had also helped him improve, he realized he couldn't just abandon these people. "No," Samuel said quietly. Nalnish looked surprised. "No? I'm staying, Samuel said, his voice getting stronger as he spoke. These people have been good to me. If they're in danger, I want to help. You know nothing about fighting, Nalnish pointed out, which was absolutely true. Then teach me, Samuel replied. I can learn. Nalnish stared at Samuel for a long moment as if trying to decide whether this pale young trader was serious or just talking foolishly out of fear. What he saw in Samuel's face must have convinced him because he nodded slowly. You could be killed, Nalnish warned him. I could be killed running away too, Samuel said. At least this way I'd die trying to help people I care about. The words surprised Samuel as much as they seemed to surprise Nalnish. When had he started caring about these people so much? When had their safety become more important to him than his own? But the truth was undeniable. Over the past weeks, this community had become more of a home to him than anywhere he'd ever lived. These people had seen him at his worst, foolish, ignorant, and weak, and had still been willing to teach him and accept him as he tried to improve. Nalnish studied Samuel's face for another moment, then called out to several Apache men. They came over, and Nalnish explained Samuel's decision to stay and fight. The men looked skeptical. Samuel could see it in their expressions even though he couldn't understand their words. One of them, Key, the young warrior who had first mocked Samuel as being like a prairie dog, spoke up with obvious doubt in his voice. Samuel didn't need a translation to know that Key was pointing out all the reasons why having Samuel in a fight would be more dangerous than helpful, but Nalnish held up a hand for silence and spoke, firmly to the group. Whatever he said seemed to settle the argument, at least for now. They think you will get in the way, Nalnish told Samuel honestly. They think you will get people killed because you do not know what you are doing. They're probably right, Samuel admitted. But I'm still staying. Nalnish nodded slowly. Then we must make you useful quickly. The rest of the day was unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. The Apache men began preparing for battle with an efficiency that was both impressive and frightening. Weapons were checked and sharpened, ammunition was counted, and plans were made for defending the camp. Samuel found himself in the middle of a crash course in desert warfare. Nalnish and the other men showed him how to load and fire a rifle, how to take cover behind rocks and bushes, and how to move quietly across rough ground. His first attempts at shooting were embarrassing. Samuel had never fired a gun before, and the noise and kick of the rifle startled him so badly that his first shot went wildly high, probably missing the target by 20 feet. Again, Nalnish said patiently. Helping Samuel reload, Samuel tried again and again, until his shoulder was sore from the rifle's recoil, and his ears were ringing from the noise. But gradually his shots started getting closer to where they were supposed to go. He was never going to be a marksman, but at least he might be able to hit something if he was close enough. The lessons in moving quietly were even more challenging. Samuel's boots, designed for Pennsylvania's soft ground, made noise with every step on the rocky desert surface. His pale skin and light-colored clothes stood out against the browns and reds of the landscape like a flag. You move like a wounded buffalo, Key commented after watching Samuel try to sneak up on a practice target. It wasn't meant as encouragement, but Samuel took it as a challenge. He practiced moving quietly until his feet were sore and his legs ached from crouching. Slowly, painfully, he began to learn how to place his feet more carefully and how to use the natural cover of rocks and bushes. As the sun began to set, Samuel realized that Nalnish hadn't just been teaching him how to fight. The Apache leader had been testing him, seeing if he would stick to his decision to stay when faced with the reality of what fighting meant. The test had been harder than Samuel expected. Learning to shoot and move like a warrior in one day was impossible, and everyone knew it. But what mattered wasn't whether Samuel could become an Apache fighter overnight. What mattered was whether he would keep trying even when it was clear he might not be very good at it. You did better than I expected, Nalnish said as they cleaned the rifles in the fading light. Samuel looked at him in surprise. I missed most of my shots and made enough noise to wake the dead. Yes, Nalnish agreed with what might have been a tiny smile. But you kept trying, and you listened when we told you what to do wrong. That night, as the Apache community prepared for the battle that might come the next day, Samuel sat by the fire trying not to think about how scared he was. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from exhaustion or fear, he wasn't sure. Hostine Begay came and sat beside him, the old man's presence somehow calming. You are afraid, the old man observed. Samuel saw no point in denying it. Yes, good, Hostine Begay said. Fear keeps you alive if you do not let it control you. They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames dance and listening to the quiet conversations around the camp. Finally, Samuel spoke up. "Why did Nalnish let me stay? I'm not a warrior. I'll probably just get in the way." Hosteen Begay considered this question seriously before answering. "A man's courage is not measured by his skill with weapons," he said finally. "It is measured by what he is willing to risk for others." Samuel thought about that as he lay down to try to sleep. Tomorrow he might face his first real test of courage. Not the kind that involved impressing people with trading skills or surviving a storm, but the kind that might cost him his life. He was terrified, but he was also oddly proud. Whatever happened tomorrow, he knew he had made the right choice. These people had given him more than just lessons in language and horse trading. They had shown him what it meant to belong to a community, to be part of something larger than himself. As he drifted off to sleep, Samuel's last conscious thought was a prayer that he would have the courage to live up to the trust that Nalnish and the others had placed in him. The next day would test everything he had learned, not just about fighting, but about what it truly meant to stand with people you cared about when everything was on the line. Samuel woke before dawn to the sound of someone shaking his shoulder gently. His eyes opened to see Nalnish crouched beside him, the Apache leader's face serious in the dim morning light. "They are not coming," Nalnish said quietly. Samuel sat up, confused. The raiders? The scout was wrong about their path. They went east toward the settlements. "We are safe, but—" Nalnish paused, studying Samuel's face. "But I have seen something in you these past days. Something that needs to be tested properly." Samuel rubbed his eyes, still trying to wake up fully. "What do you mean?" Nalnish stood and gestured for Samuel to follow him. They walked to the edge of the camp, where the desert stretched out endlessly in all directions. The first hints of sunrise were starting to paint the eastern sky in pale colors. "You say you want to be part of this community," Nalnish said. "You say you have learned our ways. But learning in camp, with teachers and help always near, this is not the same as knowing if you can survive when you are alone." Samuel felt his stomach drop. He had a feeling he knew where this conversation was heading. "Among our people," Nalnish continued, "when a young man wants to prove he has become a warrior, he must pass a test, 7 days and 7 nights alone in the desert, with nothing but what he can carry and what the land provides." 7 days. Samuel's voice came out higher than he intended. 7 days, Nalnish confirmed. "No food except what you can find. No water except what you can locate or catch. No shelter except what you can build. No help from anyone." Samuel looked out at the harsh landscape, remembering how lost and helpless he'd felt just a few weeks ago when he'd first arrived. Now Nalnish was suggesting he go out there completely alone with no supplies and no backup plan. "What if I get lost? What if I can't find water?" Samuel asked. "Then you die," Nalnish said simply. "Just as any of our young men would die if they were not ready for the test." The blunt honesty was both terrifying and somehow reassuring. At least Nalnish wasn't pretending this would be easy or safe. "Why?" Samuel asked. "Why does it have to be so dangerous?" Nalnish was quiet for a moment, watching the sun climb higher above the desert horizon. "Because the desert does not care about your good intentions," he said finally. "It does not care that you helped save our belongings in the storm, or that you stayed to fight raiders. The desert only cares whether you can survive." Samuel understood. This wasn't about punishment or hazing. It was about proving, to himself and to the community, that he had truly learned to live in this harsh environment. "When?" Samuel asked. "Today. The morning is still cool, good for traveling, and—" Nalnish looked at him seriously. "If you are going to do this, it is better to do it now, while you are still brave enough to try." Samuel's mouth went dry, but he nodded. "What can I take?" "The clothes you wear, a knife. Nothing else." Samuel thought about everything Hosteen Begay had taught him over the past weeks. How to find water by watching where birds flew and looking for the right kinds of plants. How to read the signs that showed which direction led to better ground. How to build shelter from rocks and brush. How to find food in a landscape that looked empty to untrained eyes. The lessons had seemed interesting when he was learning them safely in camp. Now they might be the difference between life and death. "I'll do it," Samuel said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Nalnish nodded, but Samuel caught something in the Apache leader's expression. Concern, maybe even worry. "You do not have to do this," Nalnish said. You have already proven much. No one will think less of you if you choose not to risk your life. Samuel considered this. It was true that he'd already come further than anyone had expected. He could probably continue living with the Apache people, continue learning their ways, continue earning their respect gradually. The dangerous test wasn't required, but something inside Samuel knew that it was required, at least for him. He needed to know if all his learning had been real or just surface knowledge that would disappear the moment he was truly challenged. I need to do this, Samuel said, for myself, if not for anyone else. Nalnish studied his face for another moment, then nodded. Come, we will prepare you. The preparation was surprisingly brief. Nalnish gave Samuel a sharp knife and checked to make sure his boots were in good condition. Hostine Begay offered a few last-minute reminders about finding water and avoiding dangerous plants. Ayana gave him a small leather pouch that she said would be useful, though she didn't explain what for. Remember, Hostine Begay said as Samuel prepared to leave. The desert will teach you, but only if you listen. Do not fight the land, work with it. Samuel nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what the old man meant. He supposed he would find out soon enough. The Apache people gathered to watch him leave, and Samuel was struck by how different this felt from his first day at the trading post. Then people had been watching him with amusement and skepticism. Now their faces showed concern and something that looked like respect. 7 days, Nalnish said as Samuel began walking toward the desert. We will watch for your return. Samuel raised his hand in acknowledgement and kept walking. Behind him, he could hear quiet conversations in Apache, but he forced himself not to look back. This was his test now, and he had to face it alone. The first few hours weren't too bad. The morning was still relatively cool, and Samuel felt confident about the direction he was heading. He'd learned to read the landscape well enough to avoid the worst terrain, and he found a small amount of water in a rocky depression that had collected rainwater from the recent storm. But as the sun climbed higher and the temperature began to rise, Samuel started to realize just how challenging the next 7 days were going to be. The water he'd found was barely enough for one good drink, and he had no idea when he might find more. The landscape that had seemed interesting and varied from the Apache camp now looked monotonous and hostile. By midday, Samuel was already feeling the effects of the heat and his limited water supply. His mouth was getting dry, and he could feel sweat evaporating from his skin almost as fast as his body produced it. He found some shade under a large rock outcropping and decided to rest during the hottest part of the day. As he sat in the shade, Samuel tried to remember everything he'd been taught about desert survival. Water was the most important thing. Without it, he wouldn't last more than a few days. Food was secondary, though he'd need some energy to keep moving and thinking clearly. Looking around his makeshift shelter, Samuel started to notice things he might have missed before. There were signs that animals had been here recently, tracks in the sand and droppings that suggested this might be part of a regular route to water. If he followed the animal trails, they might lead him to a water source. Samuel also noticed some plants growing in the crevices of the rocks that looked familiar from Hostine Begay's lessons. Not the kind that would provide much nutrition, but some that might give him a small amount of moisture if he prepared them correctly. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel began to feel more confident. He was hot and thirsty, but he wasn't panicking. The knowledge he'd gained over the past week seemed to be holding up under pressure. He could do this, but the desert had other plans. On the second day, Samuel made his first serious mistake. Feeling confident after finding a small spring and spending a relatively comfortable night, he decided to take what looked like a shortcut across a flat area that seemed to stretch toward some promising hills in the distance. What Samuel didn't realize until it was too late was that the flat area was actually a dry lake bed covered with a thin crust of salt and dried mud. When he was halfway across, the crust gave way under his feet, and he found himself knee-deep in sticky, foul-smelling mud. The more Samuel struggled to get out, the deeper he sank. Panic began to set in as he realized that the mud was acting almost like quicksand, holding him firmly in place while he exhausted himself trying to escape. For a terrifying few minutes, Samuel thought he might die right there, trapped in the middle of nowhere with no one even knowing where to look for him. But then he remembered something Hostine Begay had told him about not fighting the land. Instead of struggling frantically, Samuel forced himself to stop moving and think. He spread his arms wide to distribute his weight and began moving very slowly, working one leg free inch by inch. It took what felt like hours, but eventually he managed to pull himself back onto solid ground. Samuel lay on his back in the sun, covered in stinking mud and exhausted from the effort. His water supply was low, and he'd wasted precious energy on his mistake. Worse, the detour had taken him far from the path he'd planned to follow, and he wasn't entirely sure which direction would lead him back toward familiar territory. But as he lay there, Samuel realized something important had happened. He'd faced a life-threatening situation and had managed to think his way out of it instead of panicking. The skills and knowledge he'd learned weren't just theories. They actually worked when it mattered. Over the next few days, Samuel faced challenge after challenge. He got lost and had to spend a full day retracing his steps. He ate some berries that made him violently sick and cost him precious water through vomiting. He spent one miserable night shivering in inadequate shelter during an unexpected cold snap. 3 days after Samuel's return from the desert, Nalnish approached him with an expression that Samuel had never seen before. The Apache leader looked almost nervous, which was strange because Samuel had never known Nalnish to be uncertain about anything. "We need to talk," Nalnish said simply. "Come with me." Samuel followed him away from the main camp to a quiet spot overlooking a small canyon. The sun was setting, painting the rock formations in deep shades of red and purple. It was the kind of view that still took Samuel's breath away, even after weeks in the desert. For a long time, they sat in silence. Samuel had learned that Apache people were comfortable with quiet, unlike the constant chatter he was used to from back east. But tonight the silence felt different, heavy with something unspoken. Finally, Nalnish began to speak, his voice unusually formal. "When you first came here," he said, "we saw a foolish young white man with soft hands and worthless trinkets. We thought you would run home to your mother within a week." Samuel nodded, remembering those first terrible days when everything he did seemed wrong and everyone seemed to be laughing at him. "But you did not run," Nalnish continued. "Instead, you stayed. You learned. You proved your courage in the storm, your commitment when the raiders threatened us, and your strength in the desert test." "I had good teachers," Samuel said quietly. Nalnish shook his head. "Teaching means nothing if the student does not have the right spirit. Many men have tried to learn our ways. Most fail because they do not truly open their hearts to change." Samuel wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but he could sense that something important was coming. "In our tradition," Nalnish said, "there are different ways to show honor and respect. Some are small, sharing food, teaching skills, offering help when needed. But there is one honor that is greater than all others." Samuel waited, his heart starting to beat faster for reasons he didn't understand. "Tonight, the Council of Elders met to discuss you," Nalnish said. "We talked for many hours about what you have done, what you have learned, and what kind of man you have become." The idea that the Apache elders had been discussing him was both flattering and terrifying. Samuel knew that these were the wisest and most respected people in the community, individuals whose opinions carried enormous weight. "What did they decide?" Samuel asked. Nalnish was quiet for another moment, then turned to look directly at Samuel. "They decided that you are no longer an outsider learning to live among us. You have proven yourself to be a true member of this community, worthy of the same respect and trust we give to our own sons." Samuel felt a warm feeling spread through his chest. After all his struggles and mistakes, to be accepted as a full member of the Apache community was more than he had ever dared hope for. But Nalnish wasn't finished. "Because of this," he continued, "the council has authorized me to offer you the highest honor we can give to someone who was not born among us." Samuel held his breath. "We offer to make you our brother in blood and in spirit," Nalnish said solemnly. "And with that brotherhood comes the right, if you choose to accept it, to join your life with one of our people in marriage." Samuel's mind went blank. Marriage? He hadn't even thought about such a possibility. He'd been so focused on just surviving and learning that the idea of romance or family had never crossed his mind. I don't understand," Samuel stammered. Nalnish smiled, the first time Samuel had seen him look genuinely amused in days. "3 of our young women have expressed interest in you," he said. "Not the foolish boy who arrived with the wagon full of trinkets, but the man you have become." Samuel felt his face burning with embarrassment and confusion. 3 women. Ayana, who taught you to work with plants and saw your gentleness with difficult tasks. She is a widow with great skill in healing and crafts. She would be a good partner for someone who values wisdom and kindness. Samuel thought of Ayanna, the middle-aged woman who had been so patient with his clumsy attempts to learn traditional skills. She was intelligent and capable, and had always treated him with respect even when he was making foolish mistakes. Nasha, who is young and strong, and has often spoken of your courage during the storm. Nalnish continued. She is the daughter of one of our best hunters and has many skills that would benefit a household. Samuel remembered Nasha, a woman perhaps his own age who was known for her skill with horses and her quick laugh. He'd noticed her watching him sometimes during his training, but he'd assumed she was just curious about the strange white man trying to learn Apache ways. And Desba, Nalnish said, who is the granddaughter of Hosteen Begay, and has said that your willingness to learn shows the kind of wisdom she values in a man. Desba was younger than the other two, maybe 20 years old, with bright eyes and a quick mind that had helped Samuel many times when he was struggling with language lessons. Samuel had always enjoyed talking with her, but again, he'd never thought of her as anything more than a friend and teacher. I never realized, Samuel began, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. Of course not, Nalnish said with amusement. You were too busy trying not to die or embarrass yourself to notice that people were watching you and forming opinions about the kind of husband you might make. Samuel shook his head in amazement. But I'm not Apache. I'm an outsider. Why would they want to marry someone like me? Nalnish's expression became serious again. Because you are no longer an outsider, he said firmly. Because you have proven that you can live in this land and contribute to this community. Because you have shown honor and courage and the willingness to put others before yourself. Samuel sat quietly, trying to process this unexpected turn in his life. Marriage had always seemed like something far in the future, something he would think about after he'd established himself as a successful trader and built up some wealth. But now he was being offered something completely different. Not just marriage, but full acceptance into a community that had become more important to him than any amount of money. This is a great honor, Nalnish said, but it is also a great responsibility. If you accept, you will be expected to provide for a family, to defend this community, to follow our customs and laws. You will no longer be Samuel the trader who might someday return to his old life. You will be Samuel the Apache, with all the duties that come with that identity. Samuel understood. This wasn't just about marriage, it was about choosing a completely different path for his entire life. If he said yes, he would be giving up any possibility of returning to Pennsylvania, of taking over his father's business, of living the comfortable life he'd always assumed was his destiny. What if I'm not ready? Samuel asked. What if I make a bad husband? What if I can't provide for a family the way an Apache man should? Nalnish considered this question seriously. No man knows if he is ready for marriage until he tries, he said. But we have watched you learn and grow. We have seen you face challenges and overcome them. The council believes you have the character to succeed. As they sat watching the last light fade from the western sky, Samuel thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. The naive young man who had arrived with a wagon full of cheap goods seemed like a different person entirely. That Samuel had been focused on making quick profits and impressing people with flashy merchandise. He had measured success by how much money he could make and how quickly he could achieve his goals. But this Samuel, the one who had learned to read the desert, to find water where none seemed to exist, to work with his hands and contribute to a community, this Samuel had different priorities. He valued relationships over profit, respect over admiration, and belonging over individual achievement. Can I have time to think about it? Samuel asked. Of course, Nalnish replied. This is not a decision to make quickly, but do not take too long. The women who have expressed interest deserve to know your intentions. That night, Samuel lay awake staring at the stars and trying to imagine what his life might look like if he accepted this offer. Marriage to an Apache woman would mean children who would grow up in this desert, speaking Apache as their first language and learning the traditional ways from birth. It would mean giving up his dreams of wealth and status back east, but replacing them with something deeper. A real home, a real family, and the satisfaction that came from being a valued member of a close-knit community. Samuel thought about each of the three women Nalnish had mentioned. Ayanna, with her gentle wisdom and healing skills. Nasha with her strength and laughter, Desba with her quick mind and kind heart. Any of them would make a good wife, and he could imagine being happy with any of them. But more than that, he could imagine the kind of man he might become as an Apache husband and father. Someone who contributed to the community, not through clever trading but through useful skills and steady character. Someone who taught his children to respect the land and the people around them. Someone who had found his true place in the world. The next morning, Samuel woke with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in days. He knew what his answer would be. He found Nalnish preparing for the day's activities and asked if they could speak privately again. "I've made my decision," Samuel said. Nalnish looked at him expectantly. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect desert weather that made everything seem possible. Samuel woke early, his stomach fluttering with nervous excitement about what this day would bring. He had spent the previous evening in careful preparation, guided by Hosteen Bigay and several other Apache elders. They had taught him the words he would need to speak, explained the meaning behind each part of the ceremony, and helped him understand the commitments he was about to make. "Today you stop being who you were and become who you are meant to be," Hosteen Bigay had told him. "This is not something that happens to you. It is something you choose with your whole heart." Now, as Samuel prepared himself for the ceremony, he thought about those words. Everything that had happened over the past months had been leading to this moment of choice. Not the choice of whether to stay or go, he had made that decision weeks ago, but the choice of whether to fully embrace this new identity and all the responsibilities that came with it. Samuel looked at himself in the small mirror he still carried from his old trading goods. The face looking back at him was almost unrecognizable from the pale, soft young man who had arrived months ago. His skin was deeply tanned from constant exposure to the desert sun. His hands were rough and strong from daily work. His eyes had a confidence and steadiness that hadn't been there before. But the biggest change wasn't visible in the mirror. It was the knowledge that he belonged somewhere, that he had found his true purpose, and that he was about to become part of something much larger and more meaningful than anything he had ever imagined. The ceremony began in the early afternoon, when the heat of the day was starting to fade but the sun was still strong in the clear sky. The entire Apache community had gathered in a circle around a central fire, with the elders seated in positions of honor and the rest of the people arranged according to family groups. Samuel stood at the edge of the circle, wearing traditional Apache clothing that had been prepared specially for this occasion. The clothes felt different from anything he had worn before, not just because they were made from different materials, but because they represented a complete transformation of his identity. Nalnish stepped forward and began to speak in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. Samuel understood most of what was being said now, though some of the formal language was still beyond his vocabulary. Nalnish was telling the story of Samuel's journey, his arrival as a foolish trader, his gradual learning and growth, his courage during the storm and his willingness to fight for the community, and finally his successful completion of the desert survival test. "This man came to us as a stranger," Nalnish said, switching to English so Samuel could understand every word. "But through his actions and his character, he has proven himself to be worthy of our trust and our brotherhood." One by one, members of the community stood to speak about their experiences with Samuel. Ayana talked about his patience and gentleness when learning difficult skills. Key, who had once mocked Samuel as being like a prairie dog, now spoke respectfully about his determination and courage. Even some of the children stood to share memories of Samuel helping them or playing with them when his work was done. As Samuel listened to these testimonials, he felt overwhelmed by the realization of how much his life had changed. These people, who had once seen him as a laughable outsider, now spoke of him with genuine affection and respect. But the most moving speech came from Hosteen Bigay, the old teacher who had guided Samuel through so many lessons. "When this young man first came to learn from me," Hosteen Bigay said, his weathered voice carrying across the silent crowd, "I saw someone who thought he knew what he wanted but had no idea what he needed. He thought he wanted to get rich quickly and return to his old life. But what he needed was to find his true home and his true family." The old man looked directly at Samuel as he continued, "Learning the Apache way is not about memorizing words or copying actions. It is about opening your heart to become the person you were always meant to be. This man has done that. He has let the desert teach him, let our people guide him, and let his own courage carry him through tests that would have broken a weaker spirit. When the speeches were finished, Nalnish called Samuel forward to stand in the center of the circle. The Apache leader held a ceremonial knife that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. "Samuel Crawford," Nalnish said formally, "do you choose to become our brother in blood and in spirit? Do you choose to take on the responsibilities and honors of being a full member of this community? Do you choose to let go of your old identity and embrace the man you have become?" Samuel's voice was strong and clear as he answered, "I do." The blood ceremony was brief but profound. Nalnish made a small cut on Samuel's palm, then on his own, and they pressed their hands together while the elders spoke blessings in Apache. The physical act was simple, but its meaning was enormous. Samuel was now truly one of them, bound by ties that went deeper than friendship or mere acceptance. When the blood ceremony was complete, Nalnish announced that Samuel would now be known by a new name, Seyigai, which meant White Rock in Apache, representing his strength and steadfastness that had proven as reliable as the stone foundations of the desert itself. But the ceremony wasn't over yet. As the sun began to sink lower in the western sky, Desba stepped forward from where she had been sitting with her family. Samuel had spoken with her several times since Nalnish had first mentioned her interest, and their conversations had confirmed what he had hoped, that they were well matched in temperament and values, and that their respect for each other could grow into deep love. Desba was beautiful in the traditional Apache way, with strong features and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. But more than her physical beauty, Samuel was attracted to her quick mind, her gentle humor, and her deep understanding of the traditional ways that he was still learning. "Desba," Nalnish said formally, "do you accept this man as your husband? Do you choose to build a life with him and to help him continue learning the Apache way?" Desba's voice was quiet but confident as she answered, "I do." Samuel felt his heart racing as he realized that in the space of a single afternoon, he was gaining not just a new identity and a new community, but also a wife and the beginning of his own family. The marriage ceremony that followed was unlike anything Samuel had experienced in his old life back east. Instead of a formal church service with rigid traditions, this was a celebration that involved the entire community. There were traditional songs and dances, gifts of practical items that would help the new couple establish their household, and shared meals that went on long into the evening. As Samuel sat beside his new wife, surrounded by people who had become his family, he thought about the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. Less than a year ago, he had been living in Pennsylvania, dreaming of quick riches and easy success in the Western Territories. Now he was an Apache man named Seyigai, with a wife he was already learning to love and a community that valued his contributions. Instead of a wagon full of cheap trinkets, he possessed skills that were genuinely useful: the ability to find water in the desert, to repair broken tools to read the weather and the landscape, and to work alongside others for the good of the whole community. Later that evening, after the formal ceremonies were complete and the celebration had settled into quiet conversations around the fire, Samuel found himself talking with Pete, the old trader who had been there when he first arrived. "So you're really doing this," Pete said, shaking his head in amazement, "giving up the trading life to become an Apache?" Samuel looked around at the camp, at children playing games while their parents talked quietly, at young men tending the horses, at women working on crafts that would serve their families for generations. Everything looked peaceful and purposeful in the firelight. "I'm not giving up anything," Samuel said quietly. "I'm gaining everything that really matters." Pete studied his face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I reckon you might be right about that." As the night grew later and people began to drift away to their own shelters, Samuel walked to the edge of the camp with Desba. They stood together looking out at the desert landscape that had tested him so harshly when he first arrived and had now become his permanent home. "Are you happy with your choice?" Desba asked in English, though she spoke Apache most of the time. Samuel considered the question seriously. Was he happy? The word seemed too small for what he was feeling. He was fulfilled in a way he had never experienced before. He was part of something larger than himself. He had found work that mattered and people who valued him for who he was rather than what he could provide. "I am more than happy," Samuel said finally. "I am home." Desba smiled and took his hand. "Good," she said, "because now the real work begins. Learning to be a husband, maybe someday a father, and a full member of this community." The tests you have passed so far were just the beginning. Samuel squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses on her palm from years of useful work. I'm ready, he said, and realized that for the first time in his life he truly meant it.